Before I introduce today's speaker, I should say that one of our fastest growing programs at FPRI is our Eurasia Program, managed initially by Adrian Basora and John Haynes, who have now passed the reins on to the next generation, which include Chris Miller, who's not with us today, and Maya Otarashvili, the Deputy Director of the program. We also have Mitch Orenstein from Penn, who's part of our program as well here today. The Eurasia Program is involved in several initiatives, a Baltic initiative looking at the Baltic region, the three Baltic states, the Black Sea region. We have a special series of papers on Russian foreign policy and a special series on the Russian economy, as well as a daily briefing that you can subscribe to for free that one of our trustees says he reads religiously every day. So, and we have 5 fellows each year in the Eurasia Program, and one of our 2018 fellows happens to be Stephen Kotkin. Stephen's most recent book is Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, 1929 to 1941. Now, you're not going to believe this, but this 1,100-page book is actually the second volume in a trilogy about the life and times of Joseph Stalin. It has 106 pages of footnotes, which are in extremely small type. So it has received, both volumes so far have received widespread critical acclaim. And in fact, if you read today's Sunday New York Times book review, there's a review of the new book by John Lewis Gaddis on grand strategy. Gaddis has been running the grand strategy program at Yale University for many years, and he is known as the dean of Cold War historians. 2 weeks ago in the New York Times book review, they have a column called By the Book, where they interview a prominent author, and they interviewed John Gaddis. And the question was, which books by contemporary historians do you most admire? And Gaddis said, Stephen Kotkin's 2 volumes on Stalin. I've read every line and have had to repeatedly reconsider what I thought I knew. Now that is quite a statement from John Lewis Gaddis. And therefore, I think we're really in for a really magnificent talk from Steve, who is, I neglected to say, a professor of history at Princeton University and also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. We've asked Steve today not to talk about Stalin, but to talk about what every American needs to know about Russia under Putin. So please welcome Stephen Kotkin.
The Russia thing is good business. The world gets worse and worse, and I get more and more invitations to speak at brunches. If I were to tell you about how this is a criminal regime and the leader is a gangster, you would know all of this already. This is a very well-informed audience. You wouldn't really learn anything if I told you that kind of stuff. It is a criminal regime. There's no question about it. Use of very obviously state-only controlled chemicals to kill people abroad who are considered traitors to the state is an indication that the regime will do just about anything it wants, regardless of international law. And the beauty of this is they'll say, oh, we had nothing to do with it, but if anybody thinks about betraying our nation again, think twice. Right? This is what we call implausible deniability. Right? Implausible deniability. I could go on and on about that for you, but as I said, I don't think you'd learn that much. So I'm going to take a little bit of a deeper dive through some history and come back the other side and do 3 separate parts to the presentation. The first part will be what I'm going to call the geopolitical conundrum of Russian power in the world. The second part will be about the paradoxes of Russian power. And the third part will be about a U.S. response, or what I would call a possible U.S. response, U.S. foreign policy. So I'll run through those 3 pieces. during the course of the next 30 minutes or so, and then we'll take questions. If there's anything I failed to cover during the presentation, obviously we have plenty of time, I hope, in the question and answer to cover other things. Okay. So the first thing to say about Russia is that if you look over the long haul, there's a pattern. Everything looks personal, and the personalities matter. But the paradox is that we keep getting a similar type of person in charge of Russia. So maybe it's more than just personality. In other words, I'm not discounting personality. I'm just saying that if you look through Russian history, there's a lot of, I would say, repetition or similarity, not the same exactly, but a pattern. And I would describe the pattern this way. The first and most important piece is that Russia has always wanted to be a special country in the world, what they call a providential power or a power under God. This means that they have a special mission. They're not just a regular country. You can argue where this comes from. Does it come from the Byzantine legacy? Does it come from just being a big country? There are many different theories about where it comes from, but what's not in dispute is that it's been there a long time and is still there today. But point number two is that although this aspiration of being a providential power has been clear for a long time, Russia has never been the greatest power in the world. There have been moments in time when Russia has had a significant position. The defeat, for example, by Peter the Great of Charles XII of Sweden, which is how Russia got onto the Baltic Sea in the early 18th century. The defeat of Napoleon by Alexander, and Alexander got to Paris, for example. And, of course, the defeat of Hitler by Stalin in World War II. Other than these three peaks, Russia has not quite been as powerful as it aspires to be. So the result has been a gap, actually a gulf, between the aspirations and the wherewithal, the capacities of the Russian state. So this has led Russia time and time again, while holding these aspirations and while not fully having the capacities to live up with them, to live up to the aspirations, it's led Russia time and time again to have recourse to the state as an instrument to push the society, to push it in terms of some type of economic modernization that's coercive, a kind of state-led, right, drive to make up the difference or at least to manage the gap with the most powerful countries. It's taken different forms. There was a Tsarist version. There was a bloody, very coercive Soviet version. And there is a version today under President Putin that we would recognize. Once again, not identical throughout time, but enough similarity to recognize a pattern. This recourse to the state, right, the state as an instrument, the state as a lever to push and kind of bully the society forward towards some type of modernizing project, has produced time and again a spurt, a kind of economic spurt, and then a period of stagnation. The spurt is always followed by stagnation. So you get this recourse to the state, which looks like it's going to work, and for a time does produce some results at high cost, nonetheless then gets into a kind of bogged down quagmire situation. The fourth and final piece of this historical excursion is that the recourse to the state, the attempt to build a strong state, produces again and again personal rule. It doesn't produce a strong state. It produces a personalistic state. Right? One of the things you probably don't know is that Vladimir Putin goes on Russian television and complains endlessly that only about 20% of his orders are implemented. The rest are circumvented, ignored, right, buried in bureaucratic red tape, because personalistic rule is not as strong as we think it is. State actors are not as easily controlled in authoritarian regimes, and the more you build up the state in an authoritarian setting, the less control you have over the state officials, ironically enough. So you have aspirations to be a providential power, serious capacities, but not always the first rank in states, a recourse to the state as an instrument to force the country to try to close this gap with the most powerful countries, and then personalistic rule. And the personalistic rule, the problem with that is a conflation between the national interests and the survival of the personal regime. So to criticize the personal regime is to criticize Russia, right? There's this conflation between national interest and personalistic rule survival. That's the period we're in yet again. So in some ways, Putin is as much a symptom as he is a driver of the current state of Russia. The implications of this should be clear, right? Our bad relations with Russia are not accidental. They don't derive, for example, from a, quote, misunderstanding. You know, if we respected them more, if we understood more what they were about, relations would be good. The answer to that is no. Relations, when was the last time there was a sustained period of good relations between the United States and Russia over more than a generation into a second generation? When was the last time that happened? That's correct. Before the United States became a great power, there was a sustained period of good relations. Of course, Professor McDougall got it right. How surprised are we at that? Since the U.S. has been the leading economy in the world, which dates to about 1890s, maybe even before, relations have not been good. They've been poor. There's a fundamental clash of interests between the United States and Russia. U.S. grand strategy looks very complicated, but it's not that complicated. It could be boiled down as follows. Do not allow another country to dominate its region. What that means is that no country, not Germany, not anybody else, should be able to dominate Europe. No country, not Japan, and now not China, should be able to dominate East Asia. And no country, not Russia, should be able to dominate Eurasia. Well, what's Russian grand strategy? Russian grand strategy is dominate Eurasia. So there's a fundamental clash of interests between U.S. grand strategy and Russian grand strategy. There's also, even below that, a fundamental clash of values, right? The highest value in Russia is respect for the state. The highest value in the United States is freedom, often understood as freedom from the state. So not only is there a clash of interests, but there's a clash of values even deeper than the interest. So we would expect relations to be difficult. That doesn't mean they have to be warlike. It doesn't mean the tension has to be as high as it is now. Because differences, even differences of values, can be managed, right? That's called, for example, marriage. Everybody in this room is familiar with the problem of managing a clash of interests and a clash of values even before your kids are teenager age, right? And so we can manage better, but the idea that we can get to a friendly place with Russia has been a constant illusion, not because Russians are bad people, right? They're an incredible civilization. Their civilizational achievements are stunning. But there's a fundamental clash of interests and a clash of values, right? Which leads to difficult relations time and time again. We saw President Trump discover this. Before President Trump, President Obama went through this cycle and problem. President Bush, before him, went through this, and on it goes. Okay. So that's my first general point, right? So it's not only Putin, and it's not even primarily Putin. There's something deeper going on there. But once again, that doesn't mean that they're an enemy forever or that we're always right. It just means that we need to manage the tensions, and we could be doing a better job. All right, area number 2 of my talk. As I said, I'm going to do 3. Now I'm going to do the paradoxes of Russian power right now, and then do a final third area, much briefer, on U.S. policy vis-a-vis Russia, if that's okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. So you hear a lot that Russia is weak. That Russia is very weak. But of course, this is the natural state of Russia. It is one of the great powers. It's just never the greatest power. Right? You can recall the Soviet Union, and we thought, oh, the Soviet Union collapsed, we're done with the Russia problem. Well, it turns out we're not done with the Russia problem, even though the Soviet Union collapsed, right? Because they are weak or weaker, but they are still a major power. If you look at, for example, GDP, Russia's GDP, which is maybe 1.3 trillion, 1.4 trillion at current exchange rates. Right? If you look at Russia's GDP, it's only a little bit more than 1/15 the size of the US GDP. 1/15. The Soviet Union's GDP at peak was 1/3 the size of the American economy. Still not gigantic, but can you imagine going from 1/3 to about 1/15? That tells you that Russia is not really on the same level as the United States. At the same time, you can look at other indicators. They have a military-industrial complex. Yes, it's been inherited from the Soviet Union, so a lot of it is not credited to the current regime. But nonetheless, it has been revived under the current regime. And they're able to produce world-class weaponry of all different types. And they're able to do that even when they have budgetary austerity. So there's something effective and successful about the Russian state. We think of the Russian state as a pure kleptocracy. It's a bunch of crooks and gangsters and thieves, and they steal everything in sight. That describes a large part of Russian reality, but not all. Many people predicted, for example, that the sanctions would crash the Russian economy, that the oil price, when it dropped, would crash the Russian economy. And there they are, still there today, still investing in their military-industrial modernization, the military-industrial complex. And the reason is because they have also not just kleptocrats, but many competent people in the state. Their central bank is competently run. Their finance ministry has a tremendous number of competent people. Their macroeconomic policy over the last 20 years has been excellent since the 1998 default. It's been just excellent. And so we have to take account of these paradoxes. On the one hand, a tiny economy compared to the US economy. On the other hand, the ability to produce weapons, in fact, to sell them globally, right, and to use them that are high class. On the one hand, thieves and crooks, a kleptocratic state. On the other hand, a highly competent central bank and a highly competent finance ministry. They also have something we don't have. They have a State Department. Their foreign ministry is excellent. It's full of people who know foreign languages, have experience of other countries, and go into meetings fully briefed and fully on their brief. Right? So there's quite a lot of competence inside the kleptocratic chaos of the Russian state. So these are some of the paradoxes we don't fully understand. Right? Russia is smaller than ever, farther from Europe than ever, since Peter the Great's time. And yet, it's still in this geography of Eurasia, which means it touches on Europe, it touches on the Middle East, it touches on East Asia. And so Russia's geography is a great platform for influence projection. They have a unique geography. Russia doesn't have any allies, per se, and so it looks weak in that regard, a lonely power, but it's got one of the vetoes in the Security Council at the UN, which is why, time and again, Russia tries to push things into or through the UN, where they have significant voice. Of course, they earned that veto in the victory over the Nazi land army in World War II. So we can't seem to be able to manage this, the paradoxical nature of Russia. We paint it one way or the other way rather than both ways at the same time. And I could give you many statistics, all the averages about this and that and this and that. You know, averages are very valuable, right? If your head is in the oven and your feet are in the fridge, on average, you're comfortable. Right? You guys know that from your statistics class way back when. I could do that with all the averages about Russia. But just the deeper point is that it is weak, and yet it's a major power. Or another way to put it, it's a major power, and yet it's weak. Right? This is the story of Russia. It has some unique attributes. One of the unique attributes is daring. Not recklessness, but daring. Russia does stuff, constantly surprising us. Right? Daring. It's no use being a superpower if you behave like a wussy or an idiot. And it's quite useful if you're a weak major power, but you have a certain amount of daring and calculated risks. Right? Okay. So, third point, U.S. Foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia or U.S. foreign policy generally. A third area of discussion. I haven't really talked about the current administration. I think we'll leave that for the Q&A. There may be some people interested in that question, including, for example, relationships between the current president and people in Russia. I want to talk a little bit, given this audience, FPRI, I want to talk a little bit then about the foreign policy implications of some of what I'm saying. So to me, there's a deep paradox on the American side, which is to say we're very proud of our tradition of limited government at home. If they still taught civics, they don't teach civics anymore, but if they were still teaching civics, they would teach a story about the tradition of limited government, where it came from, the founding fathers, and the arguments at the Constitutional Convention and the formation of the United States and separation of powers, the checks and balances, and everything else, right? Things that I was taught just before they abolished civics for the next generations, right? Anyway, but paradoxically, while we cherish the tradition of limited government at home, we sometimes forget about this when we talk about foreign policy. So if our idea is that too much power of any one institution or group leads to tyranny, how could it be that we want the United States to do everything alone and to dominate the whole globe? Isn't that a violation of our own principles, of our own traditions of limited government? Wouldn't it be smarter if we had a limited government theory in foreign policy terms, so that, like at home, we would be afraid of our own excess power in the international system? In other words, maybe it would be to our advantage abroad, just like it is at home, if our power were more limited. I know that sounds ridiculous, but if you think about American values, there is a certain logic there. What would that look like in practice? What it would look like in practice is what should be familiar to this audience, traditional, a balance of power notion about the world. You'd want a lot of friends, and you'd want to consult those friends. So you wouldn't want to engage in a trade war with somebody who's cheating at trade, not because that person is innocent or that country is innocent. No, the Chinese are cheating at trade. But a trade war between the U.S. and China has very adverse effects on all of those countries that also trade and are U.S. allies. And I don't have to mention them, but you know South Korea, Japan, Germany, right? They're all U.S. allies. And so they are potential victims of a trade war that we would inflict on the Chinese, even though the Chinese deserve that. So you would instead want to preserve your alliance and your deep relationships, and you'd want to address the problem of Chinese cheating in economic terms without victimizing one of your strengths, which is your alliance system. You have more than 60 allies, and the Chinese have North Korea as their principal ally, or formal ally, right? Anyway, so just to continue this further then with the Russian story. So it's very convenient, and by the way, as I said, it's true that it's a gangster regime. On the other hand, it's still there. It's not going away. The Soviet Union went away, and we're still confronting, as I said, similar problems. So what we need with Russia is some type of negotiation. We need some type of relationship. We need some type of managing of the tensions. And we have forgotten how one does this. That's not to say we ignore violations of human rights, murders of journalists. All of that remains part of our understanding and part of our policy. But nonetheless, you can't go through, have a stable U.S. foreign policy that's sustainable over generations, whereby you don't have any relationship whatsoever with Russia. So paradoxically, again, President Trump's instincts are actually pretty good on this. He believes, and he's actually correct, that we need to get to a better place with Russia. The problem is how we would do that. Here's where the rubber meets the road. So one of the things you'll hear is, well, we have to get tough on Russia. We got to be strong. We got to show strength. And that's correct. Those people who argue for deterrence, for strength, for standing up to Russia, they're correct. Of course, you have to recognize the limitations in a policy like that. For example, Russia has an army. Ukraine doesn't really have an army. So, are you going to defend the sovereignty of Ukraine? Are you going to make a statement publicly that you're going to defend the sovereignty of Ukraine? Because if you make that statement, you're going to have to send 250,000 American boys and girls to Ukraine for a long period of time to defend that sovereignty. So if you're going to make aggressive statements of deterrence or strength against Russia, your means better line up, right, with your policy announcements. It's one thing to not recognize Russian incorporation of Crimea, right, Russian annexation of Crimea, not recognize that. We didn't recognize Soviet annexation of the Baltic republics either, as you know. So our ambassador in Moscow couldn't go to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania because the Americans didn't recognize their incorporation into the Soviet Union. Right? It's one thing not to recognize. It's another thing to talk about rollback or to talk about military confrontation. That's fine if you're ready to send 250,000 American boys and girls there to defend that sovereignty, because Russia, as I said, has a real army. And you say, well, we can arm the Ukrainians to fight themselves. You can do that, right? You can do that. Let's try that somehow. Of course, we can't arm them to the degree that the Russians are armed. And moreover, we can arm the Ukrainians to defend themselves, and then the train station in Kiev blows up. And whole bunches of people die one day. And the Russians say, oh, we had nothing to do with that. We don't know how that happened. And the Ukrainians in their capital are afraid to take mass transit because somebody set bombs in their mass transit in response to arming of eastern Ukraine to defend itself against Russia. Right? So that's the kind of escalation one could get into. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it or we should do it. I'm just talking about we have to be aware of the implications of our public statements and about our proposed policies. So getting tough with Russia, standing up to Russia, has implications. Are we ready for those implications? Once again, I'm in favor of the deterrence, of being strong, and of getting tough with them. But I understand that maybe differently from the cable TV discussion version of it, where everything is cost-free and Russia never responds and has no ability to escalate. Okay, let's turn to the other piece. Then you have some people saying, you know, Russia should be our friend. We should be more friendly with them. We should negotiate with them. And just like those who say we should get tough with Russia, I agree with that statement too. I agree completely that we should have a relationship with Russia of mutual respect and derive as much mutual benefit as we can for our own benefit, not because we want to be altruistic. But once again, the issue is how and in what form. Obviously, we need to combine the strength and the negotiation. Just to get strong and tough with somebody, and then what? You're tough with them, you impose some punishment on them, and then what happens next? Right? What happens next is you need a diplomatic negotiation so that if you're strong and they make concessions, you're ready to pocket the concessions. Our problem is we're neither getting tough with them in a smart way, nor are we in negotiations. Getting tough without negotiations is a dead end. And just negotiating without having any leverage is also a dead end. Think about the Obama administration. First, it wanted to get nice with Russia because it thought there was this misunderstanding that made the relations bad. This turned out to blow up in their face. The reset didn't work. Then they wanted to ignore Russia. And then Russia can't really be ignored because they have significant capabilities, and so they reminded the United States that they were out there. They interfered in our election process. Hello, we're still out here. You're trying to ignore us. You're trying to isolate us. We're just reminding you that we're still out here. One of the other pieces of the Obama administration policy that's not well understood is the negotiation we had with Russia. So, for example, we wanted Russia to help in Syria, so we announced that we wanted Russia to help in Syria. Now, this put all the leverage on Russia's side of the table. We announced that we wanted to do a deal on the Iranian nuclear program, and we needed Russia for that deal. Once again, we pushed all our chips, all our leverage onto the Russia side. So while there were some negotiations in the Obama case, they were negotiations not from strength, but from weakness, and we gave what leverage we had over to the Russian side before the negotiations opened up. And of course, we got nothing out of those negotiations. So the idea is, and this goes back to Reagan. By the way, it was during Reagan's presidency that I was the TA of Professor McDougall out there at Berkeley. This goes back to Reagan and Schultz, and it's not rocket science, but it is show some strength and negotiate at the same time, and then linkage of the strength and the negotiation, but not linkage of all the issues. So that if Russia, for example, murders a journalist, you break off negotiations. No, you make a statement about how this violates core principles of the international community, and you increase the pressure, but you keep the negotiations going because increasing the pressure gives you more leverage in the negotiation process. So this ability to kind of walk and chew gum, to apply our strengths, but also to have dialogue, right? To have diplomacy, or to have diplomacy that's backed up with the kind of advantages that a superpower would have. This is banal. Once again, not rocket science, but I just don't see that happening. All right. So in conclusion then, Washington right now is just not really capable of a Russia policy. We're sort of paralyzed for all the reasons that you understand. But if we were to get a Russia policy, if there were to be a Russia policy, it would involve understanding that the differences are not superficial but fundamental, yet they can be managed. It would involve understanding that Russia is weak but also a major power. And it would involve an understanding that we need to show our strengths in intelligent fashion, not overcommitting, while also using diplomacy, negotiation, right, to get those concessions and to pocket those concessions. Anyway, thank you for your attention this morning.
Thank you very much, Steve. We'll have a few minutes for questions. We have a couple of people coming around with microphones, so please raise your hand, and then we'll get the microphone to you. We have a question right here. Wait for the microphone.
Sir, thank you very much. It's a great lecture, one of the best I've heard. And I agree with you fully on practically everything. But I have two questions.
Okay.
All right. So one, you said that the Russians do develop, have developed advanced weapon systems.
Yes.
Can you name one that has been battle tested and shown that it does operate? I know they claim a lot of weapon systems that advanced, but so did Khrushchev said that they're putting out missiles like rockets like sausages, but it turned out to be that they were all out of papier-mâché. So now, lately, I think President Trump called them bluff, and they did not show that their weapon systems are working. And the second question is, so that you mentioned Crimea, but I think you didn't mention that we were one of the guarantors. We guaranteed that Ukrainian borders were not going to be violated, and when they were violated, we practically didn't do anything.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, I think the second point you raised, which is make fewer commitments, but uphold all the commitments you make. If you're not going to uphold the commitment, you got to keep quiet. And we had a problem in 1956 in Hungary. There were ways in which we encouraged the uprising against communism behind the Iron Curtain in Hungary. And then when the Hungarians rose up, we all said, oh, who's responsible for helping the Hungarians? Did I say anything? I didn't say anything. Right? So you're right. If you make a commitment, as we did to Ukraine's territorial sovereignty, we were a signatory to that when they gave up the nuclear weapons, we need to uphold that commitment. Or we shouldn't have made that commitment in the first place. That goes for all the commitments currently on record and any new ones that we might make. On your point about Russia weapon systems, so they have 7,700 nuclear weapons. 7,700. We're not sure how many North Korea might have, but it's not 7,700. Moreover, Russia has intercontinental ballistic missiles that can exit Earth's atmosphere and re-enter without burning up. We don't think North Korea has such a capability. And if they do, they can't have very many of them. But Russia has those missiles, and Russia could hit this ballroom, could hit this brunch, if they so decided accurately. Right? The missile wouldn't fishtail into the sea of Japan, next to Japan, if they send it up. Right? So we can say that, yes, the F-16 is a superior plane. And then you could go down the whole arsenal. Which is superior? This is superior. Would you trade American weaponry for Russian weaponry? The answer would be no. Of course, you wouldn't trade it. You wouldn't trade it for Chinese stuff either, right? That's not the issue. The issue is just because your fighter jet isn't necessarily superior to the latest American fighter jet doesn't mean you don't have a good fighter jet. And that's what they do have. So if you look across the capabilities, air, sea, and land, right, there are gaps between U.S. and Russian capabilities, but those gaps are less than the gaps between Russian capabilities and other European partners, let alone Eastern Europe, Central Asia. Right? Russia has a formidable arsenal. They don't have what we have, but they have enough. And so we need to take into account that this is part of the power that they exercise in the world, even as we understand your deeper point is that our stuff is better.
Ed Snitzer on this side of the room. Wait for the mic, Ed.
Professor, what would be your policy towards Russia today if you were President of the United States?
Thank you for that scary thought, Ed. The idea of becoming President of the United States is daunting. But, so we need to get to a better place with them. So what would that look like as a concrete example? So let's take Crimea. Crimea, it was stolen illegally and is under Russian occupation in international law terms, was annexed by Russia in an annexation that has not been widely recognized. You can argue that Crimea is going back to Ukraine the day after Texas is going back to Mexico. I would say that there's a possibility that it might go back after Texas goes back to Mexico. So the possibility of Ukraine getting back Crimea is not so high. So you say to yourself, okay, that's not something that we can get back very easily. Can we make something of that problem that Russia has caused, that violation of international law? And the answer could be that you will grant Russian recognition of annexation of Crimea over a 30-year period. And during those 30 years, they would have to perform certain tasks. For example, they would have to give up eastern Ukraine. They would have to pull out of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass and Lugansk. They would have to pull out of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia. They would have to pull out of Transnistria in Moldova. And then they would have to do the following with Assad in Syria. You could list a whole bunch of things that you would want to see them do. And moreover, you could make it a 30-year or a 20-year process so that during the course of that time, if they went back and cheated and did something that they promised but then took it away, you could say, well, I'm sorry, you're in violation. Moreover, you could make them pay monetary compensation for the annexation of Crimea, in addition to getting a stabilization on a whole lot of other issues. And so you say to yourself, but that would be wrong. That would be handing them, legalizing something that they stole. And it would be. But here's the thing about life. Right? Here's the thing about life. The Versailles Treaty in 1919, Ed, everybody says, well, the Versailles Treaty was a big mistake. It was a punitive treaty, and it was so punitive, it destabilized Germany, and it brought Hitler to power, and it was a mistake. And others say, oh, no, the Versailles Treaty was fine. It's just the British shrank from enforcing it. If the British had had more resolve, it would have been okay. My answer to them is wrong on both accounts, because the Versailles Treaty was an anomalous period. It was the only time since 1870 that Germany and Russia were both flat on their back. And this was not going to last. Either Germany or Russia was going to be a great power again. And the Versailles Treaty was done against Germany without Russia. And so it was an impossible treaty that was possible only in that one moment of 1919. Think about that in 1991. The 1991 settlement was imposed when Russia was flat on its back and could do nothing about it. And we think it's inviolable. We think, you know, the world inherited with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the borders that were there and all the agreements, that's forever. Well, guess what? In the 1990s, Russia couldn't do anything about it. Now they can, and they are, and they will do more. So we can, if we want, try to hold 1991 in place, even as it's unraveling, and has unraveled in many places. Or we can recognize that it was an anomalous situation in 1991 when Russia was flat on its back. That anomaly has passed. We must deal with the fact that they are able to revise the 1991 treaty and are doing that. And it would be in our interests to take the lead and stabilize that process by extracting advantages rather than let Russia continue to revise 1991 while we're holding to an impossible situation. So you could argue that that's immoral, that that doesn't uphold international law. And I would argue that, well, what's morality? Is morality committing to, for example, overturning tyranny in Iraq, making a mess of it, and then wanting to leave? Right? I mean, where does morality come in terms of your commitments and your ability to deliver on the commitments? Our gentleman mentioned that we didn't deliver on our commitment to Ukraine. We're in violation of that. There's no doubt that we are. And so the answer to that is either live up to that commitment at a cost that American society is not willing to bear right now, or revise those commitments to make them in line with our capabilities and the costs that we want to pay, and try to extract some benefits in a negotiation with that. So I don't know if it's a satisfactory answer, Ed, but thankfully they're never going to make me president.
We have time for one more question. John Medvekis.
Thank you. What do you think are Russians' intentions with the Balkans?
Yeah. So
What's the question?
about the Baltics, Russia and the Baltics.
Yes, Russia's intentions with the Balkans.
So let's imagine, John, that I want to steal your wallet. I'm a typical academic, right? I want to steal your wallet. And your wallet is in your pocket, and your pocket is zipped up. That's going to be tough for me to get that wallet out of your pocket with the zipper up, right? Let's call that NATO Article 5. But let's imagine that you put your wallet on a table, and you just leave it there in the middle of the table, and you turn around, and you don't pay attention to anybody. And I want to steal your wallet. Well, am I going to take the approach of the wallet that's in the pocket all locked up, or am I going to take the approach of the wallet that's sitting on the table like a stick of butter? So that's Russia with the Baltics. To the extent that we offer it up like a stick of butter in the middle of the table, they might do something. To the extent that we lock it up, pull that zipper, they're going to do something elsewhere where it's a lot easier than they are going to do it where it's a lot harder. So it depends in part on us, right? Russia's forward policy, as we might call it in these places, forward policy, meaning, right, offense is the best defense. They understand their security as being on the offensive, destabilizing the outside world, right? Russia's not going to become part of the West, so let's make the West more like Russia. Right? That's the strategy in a nutshell. That only works, right? That only works if you let them. You can't get away with that if, for example, the Baltics are well defended. If, for example, there are measures to counteract Russian behavior. So I don't think it's that, I'm not that worried about the Baltics as I am, for example, about many other places. But here's one thing I want to, do I have time to conclude?
Okay.
I want to conclude on this note, right? We haven't really mentioned it yet, so I just want to make sure that we're clear on this. So at the very beginning of this problem, you know, Russia interference, Russia, Trump, all of this kind of stuff, people were asking me, what's going on? What is this stuff about? How could this be happening? And it's very clear what happened, right? Think about this for a second. You have a very sophisticated military intelligence and civilian intelligence operation. You want to discredit American candidates. You want to discredit American democracy. So what are you going to do? You're going to need the services of the Buster Keaton Trump campaign in order to pull this penetration off, right? You're going to need to collude with the Trump campaign because you're Russia. You're not good enough to pull this off on your own. You can't find a WikiLeaks as a cutout to release all this information so that you have deniability. Right? You need the Trump people to do all of this. So obviously, the idea of collusion is absurd on the surface. The Russians have never had any need for any collusion from the beginning. Moreover, the idea that the Russians knew or thought Trump was going to win is also absurd. On the Friday before the Tuesday election, the Trump campaign polling operation sent out an email bragging, that is a few days before the election, the Trump campaign sent out an email bragging that they would get as many as 250 electoral votes. They were bragging at how close their loss was going to be. That was the Trump internal polling organization. That was the Trump campaign. That's what they thought was going to happen. Right? So the idea that the Russians knew what they were doing on the one hand, and therefore bet on Trump, right, but didn't know what they were doing on the other hand, and therefore they needed to collude with Trump, right? There's been an absurd discussion in the U.S. public sphere about this. What the Russians did was they compromised the Trump campaign and the Trump people. They entangled them in criminal activities, and they penetrated them with surveillance to find out what was going on the inside. It was a Russian intelligence operation. The intelligence operation was also there on the Clinton side. The Clinton people were less willing, right? They were more unwilling victims of this. And the Trump campaign was, unfortunately, a willing victim of Russia's compromising, entangling them in criminality. Right? But the point was to penetrate and compromise, so the idea of collusion is ridiculous. Just think, first of all, it's not on the American statute books in any case. There is no crime called collusion on the statute books. But so what we have is a sophisticated Russian operation that the idiotic people in the Trump campaign willingly cooperated with and entangled themselves in compromising situations, subjecting the campaign themselves and maybe even the president to blackmail. So that's why this all started as a counterintelligence investigation, which then morphed into a criminal investigation, but the origins are a counterintelligence problem. That's what the Russians did. It was an intelligence operation of penetration and compromise. One final point, if I could make on this, right? The other piece I noted at the very beginning of this, the absurdity of collusion is one piece. The other piece was that overpriced real estate is ipso facto money laundering. That's the business you're in if you're selling overpriced real estate. If you're selling a quote, luxury condominium with 1/1000th of a millimeter thick walls for $100 million, or how much per square foot, you can do the calculation. There's only certain kind of people who can buy that property or would be interested in that property. People who have stolen big amounts of money and buy overpriced real estate, parking their ill-gotten gains. So if any investigation of the Trump operation moved towards the business, they would discover the business was a criminal enterprise. Because once again, many people in the real estate business will not cross lines. They will do due diligence. They will look where the money comes from. They will decline some buyers because of the suspect nature of the money. That's, after all, what the law requires. But in this case, that organization did not do its due diligence and in many cases did the opposite. And so it was very vulnerable on the investigation if it went into the business area, which President Trump himself announced at the beginning, that it was a red line to look into his business operations. You'll recall that, right? So here we are now, confused as hell about collusion, which was a Russian entanglement in criminality on purpose that foolish people got involved in on our side. And moreover, now we're investigating the business operation where you have the money laundering, and the pincer movement is moving in. So you get the campaign manager, and then you move to the lawyer, and then you go for the son-in-law, and then the son and the daughter, until finally people break. I mean, this is a standard operating practice. People break, and so we're in potential trouble here, not necessarily because President Trump, quote, colluded with the Russians, if you understand what I mean. The idea of the president, I don't even think that that's a crime necessarily. For example, a back channel to the Russians, communicating with them. I don't think that's a crime in the United States, opening a back channel to another government that you want to talk to. I actually think that that's maybe even a good idea, let alone a crime, right? So we're in a kind of crazy situation now where what's happening behind the scenes, an investigation of the business criminality, right, which has little to do with the campaign necessarily, and we've lost the Russian intelligence operation that opened this investigation in the first place by the FBI a really, really, really long time ago. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention again.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Stephen Kotkin. It was a talk, it was a model FPRI talk giving insight into contemporary affairs through the lens of history, geography, and culture. Before you go, I would like to thank Susan Goldberg, the chairman of our Special Events Committee, Rachel Hemler, our event planner, and Eli Gilman, coordinator of all things at FPRI. Thank you for the great jobs each of you have done to make today's event such a great event. Finally, one more thing. Since Steve mentioned Professor McDougall, I should mention that on May 15th, McDougall will give the first annual Ginsberg-Sattel Lecture under FPRI auspices in co-sponsorship with the Museum of the American Revolution this is the first annual lecture on American identity and character. This particular lecture will look at where did the founders get their ideas. So join us on May 15th at the Museum of the American Revolution.